There are everyday actions to help prevent the spread of respiratory diseases. Wash your hands. Avoid close contact with people who are sick. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth. Stay home when you are sick. Cover your cough or sneeze. Clean and disinfect frequently touched objects with household cleaning spray. For more information, visit cdc.gov/COVID-19.
Furnished by the National Association of Broadcasters and this podcast.
I had this dream that all those hills had been leveled. The house is torn down. I saw it in my dream. And exactly the way I saw it, that's the way it happened.
It's the tragedy of my life. Absolutely. I was responsible for uprooting, I don't know how many hundreds of people from their own little valley and having the whole thing destroyed.
It's sort of taken on a mythical sense in people's memories, and then with the feeling that it was unfairly taken from them. So it's no wonder that people have strong feelings about it.
He said, please, your son's in a baseball team. Let's go to the Dodgers as a family. I'll never go again. I hated it. I didn't enjoy it. It was like dancing on a grave.
1962. In Chavez Ravine, a few miles from downtown Los Angeles, baseball fans crowd the bleachers of the brand new Dodger Stadium to welcome their team from Brooklyn. The stadium sits on 170 acres of freshly cleared land that just 12 years earlier was home to over 300 families. The neighborhoods of La Loma, Palo Verde, and Bishop, the neighborhoods of Chavez Ravine.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, friends, let's get this show on the road. How you doing? It's your pal, Tim Hanlon. And, of course, it's Good Seats Still Available. It's the curious little podcast adventure that we stumble through each and every week into the journeys and the explorations of what used to be in professional sports. I thank you for finding us in the realms and the depths and the wide swaths of podcast land. We appreciate your finding us and downloading us, putting us in your earbuds. And before we sort of get into the meat of the matter this week, I want to assure all of you that we are doing our best to stay safe and healthy. And I trust and hope that you are doing the same as well. I hope you're listening to all your local and regional authorities. I trust that you're finding all the accurate and important information that you need to make all the right health choices and safety choices for you and your households. And you're doing the right thing by staying at home, helping flatten that curve. Frankly, wherever you are in this country, I don't want to get sort of on a soapbox here, but I would hope and imagine that by now you are all listening to what needs to be done. And it is a trying time for all of us, yours truly included, of course. We're trying to do our best to kind of keep our weekly schedule. It's our very small and infinitesimal little part of trying to be of help and frankly, trying to distract a little, entertain and educate a little. We all know that we're fighting various things, whether it's acute illnesses and issues dealing with the virus itself, boredom by being cooped up for so long, and various things in between. So whatever part of the continuum that you're on in this still ongoing challenge that's frankly is going to last for quite some time and will require all of us to sort of dig deep and be resolute and smart and safe. We hope we can maybe distract you for an hour or so at a time with some interesting sort of backtracks into the various and wacky worlds of sports, team, and league histories as we get into this show here on Good Seats Still Available. Some of those are for frivolous and anecdote full and fun and just wacky. And that was kind of the original reason we sort of went into this little escapade about 3 years ago. And, Lord knows, because there are teams and leagues and all kinds of stuff related to that stuff that are just out and out outrageous. And we'd love to get into those sort of stories. And we have certainly done a whole bunch of those in our various episodes to date. But, we have also not shy about sort of digging into some stories that are, not so mirth-filled and humorous per se. This week is one of those for sure. And our guest this week, Eric Nusbaum, is our excuse to kind of get into another angle of the Brooklyn Los Angeles Dodgers story. And yeah, we've talked a little bit about the Dodgers generally and specifically their move westward, their abandonment, if you will, of Brooklyn, the reasons around some of that, although we want to get a little bit deeper into that in some future episodes. A little bit of the West Coast sort of embrace of the Dodgers as well as the Giants in the late 50s, early 60s as they tilled some brand new soil on the West Coast and sort of opened the door to more frequent and expansionary stuff in baseball and, frankly, pro sports. But the Brooklyn to Los Angeles Dodgers story is not sort of a direct, clear, and fully noble one, let's be honest. And our guest this week, Eric Nusbaum, the author of the book that we're going to be talking about. The book is called Stealing Home, Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and the Lives Caught in Between. And we get into what effectively is sort of referred to as the Battle of Chavez Ravine, where Dodger Stadium, now the third oldest continuous ballpark in Major League Baseball. Hopefully someday we'll all be able to go back and sort of enjoy in a more leisurely tone the sights, the sounds, and frankly, even the odors and the ambiance of professional baseball again at some point. But in the absence of that in the near term, we're going to get into kind of the story of how Dodger Stadium came to be. And, there's some really, kind of straightforward and maybe sort of, layman's gloss over, was Walter O'Malley, sort of the evil baron here and, trying to use the threat of moving to the West Coast and trying to get Brooklyn to build a new baseball stadium and domed at that. It wasn't sort of guaranteed as Walter O'Malley moved the team lock, stock, and barrel to Los Angeles that there was going to be sort of this idyllic Dodger Stadium sort of waiting for him at the end of the road. As a matter of fact, it really was not that. And there was a whole bunch of stuff that was going on in Los Angeles in the early to mid 1950s, even before the Dodgers were specifically targeted, if you will, and or O'Malley saw that it would be a path for his Brooklyn Dodgers to move. And the Battle of Chavez Ravine is a twisted, torturous, and frankly, ultimately sad story of land largely owned by Mexican Americans at the time, in the post-war time, which was literally in the crosshairs of Los Angeles officials around the idea of creating and building affordable public housing in the Los Angeles area, a progressive and common theme and thread in post-war and early 1950s thinking all around the country, not just Los Angeles, but places like Chicago and New York and other major urban areas, how affordable housing can be built and incorporated into the landscape and into urban planning as the country continued to grow and boom, frankly, in the post-World War II era. This story of the Dodgers to Los Angeles is absolutely very much entwined into that sort of realm. And we get into all of that with our guest this week, Eric Nusbaum. And, this is a story that has perhaps multiple villains, some sadness that's part of it. I think as the generations sort of roll on and the Dodgers history continues, the land itself, the story can get bulldozed over and forgotten. And obviously we want to pick through that story and make sure that it stays alive and importantly in the center of things, because it's all part of the tableau, the history of baseball in Los Angeles, the Dodgers specifically, and we get into all of that. Walter O'Malley, villain or opportunist, the Chandler family and the Los Angeles Times, what's their role in all of this? How much of this is civic pride versus private business, if you will? What is public use? Is a baseball team and privately held at that, and a profit-making venture? How much of that is for the public good and eminent domain and using that to claim land for such? All of that. Plus, there's just frankly uprooting of families, the poor versus the rich, right? Mexican Americans who were living there at the time, and their fight to sort of preserve their way of life. All of that stuff and more in our conversation this week with Eric Nusbaum as we get into his fascinating read, again, called Stealing Home, Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and the Lives Caught in Between. The clip that you heard there in the beginning is also worth finding and is a great introduction to the story. That film is called Chavez Ravine, A Los Angeles Story. It ran on PBS's Independent Lens series. It's produced by an entity called Bullfrog Films. narrated, as you might imagine, or you could probably pick up there, by Cheech Marin. And it's a great piece. It features the photography of a gentleman by the name of Don Normark, and it's directed by Jordan, we think it's Mechner. And we'll have a link to that on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. A fantastic work that really sort of puts all of this in relief. But the primer is our conversation this week, as well as the book Stealing Home with our guest, Eric Nusbaum, coming up in just a few moments. Please stay tuned for a fascinating, revealing conversation. Before we get there, a quick promotional note. By all means, why don't you visit our friends at sportshistorycollectibles.com this week in particular. Our friend Dean Mitchell and Friends has a ton of great stuff featuring the Dodgers, both of the Brooklyn variety and the Los Angeles variety. You'll find a bunch of things and memorabilia and postcards and printed material and buttons and all kinds of things around Dodger Stadium as well. And it was not called Dodger Stadium in the first few years of its existence because the Los Angeles Angels, another team you can find more stuff from at sportshistorycollectibles.com, were also inhabitants of that for the first couple of years. But all of that stuff, the Dodgers, the Brooklyn version, the Los Angeles version, the Los Angeles Angels, all of those. And by the way, all kinds of teams and leagues and sports of yore, great stuff to be found. Tremendous mementos and memorabilia at sportshistorycollectibles.com. This is the stuff that's of the highest quality. It's not sort of your generic eBay type of wares. And Dean and Friends in San Diego are meticulous in their aggregation of these great items, the photography of such. And of course, we have a great discount for you by using the promo code GOODSEATS at sportshistorycollectibles.com. You'll get 15% off everything you buy from the site. It's a great deal, and it's a great site. You'll want to bookmark it, and as they say, visit it early and often. And again, sportshistorycollectibles.com, promo code GOODSEATS, not only for Dodgers stuff, but all kinds of great sports history from all kinds of leagues and teams, frankly, that you may not even remember. And you're going to get 15% off all of your purchases when you use that promo code GOODSEATS. Once again, sportshistorycollectibles.com, promo code GOODSEATS. Thank you, Dean, and we appreciate your patronage of the show. We appreciate you listening out there and giving maybe the site a visit, maybe a purchase, and give us a few shekels of love. That'd be great. And we now encourage you to continue to listen to a fascinating and wonderful and enlightening conversation with our guest this week. Coming up, Eric Nusbaum, as we talk about the Dodgers and their move to Los Angeles and the building and the construction and the pretense of all of it at Dodger Stadium. Here's our chat that we had just a couple of days ago. Please enjoy. Why don't you give our audience a little bit of background about you generally? I suspect that this is not necessarily your day job talking about this topic, but and maybe a little bit of how you sort of became interested in this part of the story of the Dodgers and why committing your life, at least partially, to writing a book and going deep on it.
More than partially. It's been an all-consuming process the last couple of years. I am a journalist. I'm a writer. I worked as an editor at a place called Vice for almost 4 years in their sports department. And before that, I wrote for places like ESPN, The Magazine, and Sports Illustrated, Deadspin, Daily Beast. And I have always wanted to write this particular book. It is a story that I feel very passionately about and that I've felt strongly about since I was in high school. So this project is sort of the culmination for me of years of kind of practicing as a writer and researching and kind of convincing myself and the world that I could tell this story.
So what piqued your interest in and around high school? Are you a native of either Brooklyn or Los Angeles, or did you have sort of any tie to the Dodgers story and you know, the personnel involved, or just was it something you read or got inspired by from some movie, or what was the rationale?
I am a native of Los Angeles. I grew up a big Dodger fan. And when I was 16 in my high school history class, a U.S. history class, a man named Frank Wilkinson came and spoke to us about the experience of being blacklisted in the Red Scare. And he was a public housing official in Los Angeles in the 1950s who was sort of the principal engine behind a very ambitious project that was going to be called Elysian Park Heights. And Elysian Park Heights was going to be sort of a state-of-the-art utopian public housing project with 3,500 units. And it was going to sit in these hills above downtown LA that now are the home of Dodger Stadium. And he told the story of how the housing authority evicted 1,000 plus families to build this project, and how it was scuttled in a Red Scare conspiracy, which led to the Dodgers' arrival from Brooklyn. And I was just fascinated from the get-go.
Well, and this is something that I think, most sort of historians and or sort of fans of baseball, its history, we've sort of done a lot on, the expansion generally in sports and baseball in particular. And obviously the big sort of thunderbolt that was the Giants and the Dodgers leaving for the supposedly sunnier climes of Los Angeles. But, I think it's lost on a lot of people in the main sort of narrative, maybe even in L.A. too, frankly, about sort of this doesn't just, snap one's fingers and it magically happens, right? There's obviously other kinds of machinations involved. And I think maybe less sort of understood is in the case of sort of building this stadium, which, by the way, is, one of the longest standing and still used stadiums right now in baseball. There's a history behind this stuff, and it's frankly not sort of clean and free of being sort of, nefarious and or sordid. Maybe you can explain a little bit sort of what was sort of going on in and around that sort of project and that sort of desire about public housing. And maybe that'll set the scene sort of how the Brooklyn version of the Dodgers started to enter into all of it, because certainly politics and the mayor and all that kind of stuff certainly plays into it. But before all that happens, and you spend the first half of the book sort of getting into it, there is this sort of public housing aspect of it that has nothing to do with baseball, I'm assuming.
Well, nothing to do with baseball until it does, I guess. So the story really begins with these communities. There were 3 communities that were kind of nestled in these hills just north of downtown LA, and they were called Palo Verde, La Loma, and Bishop. And they were comprised almost entirely of immigrants from Mexico and then, second generation immigrants, their kids. And these communities were really tightly knit. They were a little bit kind of semi-rural almost. They were in the hills, and they didn't have great government services. There was a lot of restrictions about where non-white people could live and own property in LA. And in this particular part of the city, you could buy property, but that also came with sort of being neglected by your local government and written off, which they were. And then after World War II, there was, starting before, but really after, there was a desperate need for housing in LA. The city really boomed in the first half of the 20th century, and the population expanded rapidly, and it became a sort of desperate thing. How are we going to house everybody? And at the time, public housing hadn't yet gone out of fashion, and there was this notion that, we could plan great communities for people, and the government could build them and rent them out at a reasonable price and get people on the path to home ownership down the line. But there were obviously opponents to that idea, and they were, real estate developers, builders, property owners around the city who didn't like that idea and didn't want their tax dollars going to subsidize housing for people. So what you have is this particular sort of political issue and these communities colliding when the city decides to make the site of these communities the site of its most ambitious public housing project in 1949.
That's that was the National Housing Act of 49, yeah?
Yes. So they got a bunch of federal funds after Harry Truman signed the National Housing Act, which provide a lot of money for public housing around the country, and also did a lot to secure mortgages and sort of stabilize and regulate the private home industry. Sorry, not to get off topic. So what happens is that this guy, Frank Wilkinson, who spoke to my history class, goes door to door, around these neighborhoods, and he's telling people that they're going to have to leave their homes. And for a few years, it looks like it's going to happen that way. Property owners start to sell. The neighborhood clears out little by little, but a few people in the neighborhood are resisting. And while this is happening, the sort of conservative arch powers in LA are aligning to stop public housing and to take back control of the mayorship from a moderate pro-housing mayor. So in 1952, this guy, Frank Wilkinson, is testifying at an eminent domain hearing related to Elysian Park Heights, related to the housing project. And the attorney for the plaintiff suddenly starts to ask him to name his political affiliations throughout his life. And that's a very obvious code for tell us if you're a member of the Communist Party. Frank refused to answer, but it turned out that he was a member of the Communist Party, and that information had somehow become known to his opponents. And really, as soon as that happened, that was the end of public housing in LA. The walls came crashing down. These people had been evicted from their homes for no reason. And suddenly the city was left with this giant lot, mostly cleared out, that it didn't know what to do with.
So I'm sorry. So this idea of this progressivism, if you will, of generally the National Housing Act and its specific applicability to the situation in Los Angeles was dramatically, I guess, conflated now with that of the Red Scare and communism that was also sort of besetting the United States at this time with the McCarthy hearings and the such.
Yeah, what you have is as sort of these like progressive social programs start to gain steam, and maybe not even gain steam. Some of it's kind of leftover momentum from the New Deal and FDR, but you really get the sort of coinciding rise of McCarthyism. You get the rise of J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI and the rise of HUAC and all these sort of establishments that are sort of building political power and capital by taking down social programs and by accusing people of communism, often sort of nefariously and recklessly.
So it's interesting because, and obviously, you look at other sort of regions in the country, right? Chicago with sort of these sort of large, sort of concentrated, multi-tiered structures in urban areas. That was sort of their way. In New York, obviously, and the Robert Moseses of the world trying to sort of figure out how to. But it's also extremely interesting in that in the LA case, it sounds like it was sort of making, if you will, progress using sort of a blend of eminent domain and I guess, I don't know, strong-arming various owners of properties to kind of sort of buy into and or assume that this was inevitable. And it almost seems like it takes a complete 90-degree turn at sort of this point when it becomes sort of a bigger, more controversial and maybe less assured sort of approach.
Yeah, I mean, the people who were advocating for public housing in LA were not doing it so they could, maybe they were on some level, but they really believed, they were true believers in the idea that public housing could lead us to a better world. That was their deep down belief. Even some of the planners who designed Elysian Park Heights and architects, this particular project was going to involve these tall towers. And because of the kind of soil that was in that area, they needed to get a certain amount of density, so they had to build up. And at the time in LA, that just the very notion of building kind of vertical housing units for people was extremely off-putting to a lot of housing advocates. They thought it would be sort of counterproductive to the idea of making a clean living, sort of pleasant public housing project. So if you go now around LA and you look at public housing projects, they're all kind of garden apartment style. They're sprawled out. They're not towers like you had in Chicago or New York.
Right, like the Cabrini Greens in Chicago, notorious. And based on my sort of research and the reading of your book, which is just, it's fascinating. We'll get into more of it. Yeah, I mean, there wasn't just a handful of these towers. I think it was like something in,
13 towers. It was going to be 13 towers on the hill. That's
amazing. And you think about sort of how LA is sort of structured and whatnot. And frankly, can you envision that now where Dodger Stadium sort of sits? It would look odd, I guess, right? Now, that obviously assumes that other projects like this might then sort of also dot the landscape. But wow, that's a pretty dramatic and bold view, say, of how the urban landscape would look in the early 50s if it were to go through.
Yeah, one of the planners compared it to an acropolis, like a Greek acropolis for LA. It was, I mean, architecturally, and I can tell you this, the renderings were stunning. I mean, it was Richard Nitra, who was one of the great kind of California architects of the time, was behind it. And it would have been, at least for a little while, I think, from a distance, beautiful. But I don't know if that would have been the right thing for the city or not. And I think the people who live there would have told you that it certainly would not have been the right thing for the city.
Well, so this battle for then Chavez Ravine, I guess, is sort of now enjoined, right? Because now it becomes a little bit more, well, actually a lot more, what's going to happen to this land that's been, if you will, partially or significantly acquired and or recategorized, I guess. What happens now, given sort of this dramatic turn of events?
So the book follows kind of the principal heart of the book is this family, the Arechiga family, and especially the matriarch of the family, Abrana Arechiga. And she had come to the United States from Mexico when she was a teenager, lived in Arizona in a copper mining town, and then came to LA in the early 20s. And she and her husband built their house, by hand. And they kind of become keys in this fight over what's going to happen next. They refused to sell to the government. They had been engaged in a legal battle to, stop the public housing project. And so,
and by the way, they weren't the only ones resisting, right? I mean, it was
no, not at all. It was a community of people who had become accustomed to having to fight to get, a community center built or to get bus service. So there was already a sense of determination and a sense of self-determination amongst the people of these three communities. And they took the fight kind of to the city government and to the state. And so you have this land that's sort of been altered, right? Houses have been demolished and some of them have been rolled down the hill to other parts of the city. Dirt is going up and down, grounds are getting leveled, but now you still have people who live there and in this sort of half destroyed community. And they basically threw every wrench they could to make sure that they got their land back. Their argument was that you took our house or tried to take our house to build a public housing project. That's not happening. You have no more standing to take our home.
Yes, it almost seems like they're even more vulnerable now than sort of the decision about whether to sell or not, especially now given the sort of uncertainty and the change of plans. But maybe you could also sort of mention, I think, what seems to be sort of a major turning point in all this is the election of Norris Poulsen as mayor, right? Because that certainly plays a major role into sort of maybe now what's going to come out of the quote unquote ashes of what was originally planned.
Yes. So Norris Poulsen was pretty much a little known, little regarded congressman. And in the end of 1952, sort of this council of LA elders led by Norman Chandler, who owns the LA Times, decides on him. I mean, they literally had a meeting and picked him to be their candidate for mayor the following year to defeat housing and kind of be a business-friendly patsy mayor. I mean, Poulsen literally described this happening to him. They said they would give him a Cadillac to drive around in, and he says, okay, and he does it. And he becomes the mayor of LA in 1953. And his first order of business is to basically end the city's agreement with the federal government over the funds they had gotten to build all this housing. So that leaves the city with this position where the city had acquired the land and they technically owned it, even as the residents who were resisting stayed. So they were in a position where they had to use the land for a quote unquote public purpose because the land had been acquired by the government with eminent domain. And now they're sitting here kind of with these tenants they don't want and no real sense of what to do next with these hills overlooking downtown.
Let me stop you right there because I just want to unpack that a little bit because, first of all, we're talking about an era when newspapers actually were, dare I say, relevant and powerfully so. And you're mentioning the Chandler family. I don't think I can escape the narrative here without sort of asking, I guess, the question about how influential truly and or manipulative, perhaps, the Chandler family, the Times, and all of that were in, I guess, for lack of a better term, standing up Poulsen as a mayoral candidate. I mean, I guess what I'm sort of getting at and maybe sowing the potential questionable seed around is how entwined are these two actors, shall we say, and is even baseball even on the radar at this point, maybe behind the scenes, maybe unwittingly even to Poulsen? I don't know.
So baseball is on the radar, and this goes beyond Norman Chandler. You know, baseball, LA was already a baseball town before the major leagues came. There was two teams in the Pacific Coast League, the Hollywood Stars and the LA Angels. They each had nice stadiums. They had big followings. They had good players. You know, times in the 40s, you could have argued that the Coast League was better than certain National League and American League teams.
Absolutely.
And so this was not, you know, like a backwater, right? We're talking about a city that God, by the time the Dodgers came, LA had double the population of Boston, and Boston had two teams in the 50s, and LA didn't have one. So baseball is kind of happening. There's a lot of actors in LA who are trying to bring the majors in as early as like the early 40s. St. Louis Browns almost came to LA right before Pearl Harbor, and then World War II ended that possibility. And there was a few other kind of false starts, but so there had been ongoing efforts to make LA a big league city, and that was very important to a lot of people in LA. To get baseball was a sort of symbol of being established, of being a truly American capital. And even though I think baseball was a lot smaller as an institution, in terms of its physical footprint then, it held even more symbolic power. So you have people trying to bring baseball to LA while all this is happening throughout. And there's a million different ideas being thrown out there for stadiums. In the early 50s, while the housing thing is happening, on the same ballot, actually, as Norris Polson getting elected mayor, there's a young councilwoman named Rosalind Wyman, who is a progressive Democrat running as a 22-year-old for city council, and she wins partly on a platform of bringing baseball to LA. So this is really happening at the same time. And to speak to Norris Polson and the Chandler family and the Times, I actually think looking at them as separate actors is probably a mistake. Not to disrespect Norris Polson, but he was just a little bit of foam on the Chandler wave. He doesn't exist as mayor of LA without the Chandlers and without their allies. I don't think the Chandlers were looking at using this land as a baseball stadium at the time. I think they were looking at cementing their power. And although LA was not a one-paper town, the LA Times were very powerful, and the Chandlers did not just own one paper.
That's extremely interesting, and/or I'm sure there is even conjecture on that. But I guess it's not too far afield to say that he's arguably maybe a puppet of the Chandler family, if you will, and some of the I guess designs perhaps on what maybe altruistically, maybe not, about what Los Angeles could and should look like. But it's also interesting to hear sort of the confluence of how baseball, frankly, not from one particular side of the, I guess, political or progressive aisle or the other, right? Where it almost feels in some respects that, and you just gave a couple of examples, that, baseball is looked upon and almost aligned with a number of different sort of political viewpoints. And arguably that becomes interestingly maybe you would think a unifying thing, but baseball certainly is interesting across the aisle, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, everybody loves baseball, right? That's across, race and across political party and across different regions of the city. I don't think there was a partisan opposition to baseball. In fact, I think this whole story, you end up with some really strange and unlikely political alliances in LA.
Yeah, but I guess it's also different if you're in the zone as it becomes, and maybe we can get into that part of it, is sort of how this sort of plan begins to surreptitiously and obviously reveal itself. If you're in the crosshairs of still owning property there, perhaps, even if you are a quote unquote baseball fan, then it becomes a little bit different, right? Because it becomes a little NIMBY here. I don't want it in my neighborhood per se, or the intrigue seems to be building here.
Yes. So obviously, you can see the inevitable collision happening at the end of this highway. There's a mostly empty patch of land near downtown at the confluence of two freeways. There's a city that's desperate for a baseball team, and there's a few kind of scrappy homeowners fighting to preserve their community. You can guess who's going to win that fight.
How does it play out? How do the forces of government and maybe perhaps how the Brooklyn and O'Malley part of it sort of comes into play as being the driving force of it? I guess which came first, the desire for baseball and they will come, or Brooklyn essentially making itself more pronounced as the actual team that might actually wind up. Maybe a little bit of insight as to how sort of the mechanics of some of that sort of comes about.
Yeah, absolutely. So there were efforts to bring baseball into LA, specifically, with the city negotiating with teams going back a decade. And there were also times when the city would kind of wink at Walter O'Malley in Brooklyn and say, hey, come to LA. The Dodgers at the time were, like they are now, a model franchise. They were big, they were famous, they won a lot. They were in the World Series every year, even if they weren't winning the World Series. They were an iconic team in Brooklyn. And people in LA kind of had this idea that we don't want a bad team. We want a team that's worth our own greatness, our own sense of self. So the Dodgers became a sort of dream target. Abbott and Costello would talk about how the Dodgers should come to LA. I mean, it was an open fantasy of the city, and throughout the 50s,
who do you think is flirting more with the idea? Is it?
Oh, it's definitely LA. Walter O'Malley, I think at this point still sees Brooklyn as his home, and I learned a lot about this from a book called City of Dreams by Gerald Poder, and he does an amazing job of sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of these negotiations. So what's happening is that in New York, Walter O'Malley wants a new stadium. The Dodgers play in Ebbets Field, which was beloved, but it's also kind of a dump. It doesn't have amenities. It's small. It's falling apart. It doesn't have parking, which is a fixation for Walter O'Malley, and it was a fixation for everybody in mid-century America. So you have this guy who wants a new stadium, but he wants to stay in Brooklyn, and he wants to be the private owner of the stadium. And then you have the aforementioned Robert Moses, who controls everything in New York, especially when it comes to public land. And he insists that the Dodgers move to Queens and play in a publicly built stadium. That ends up happening. It becomes Shea Stadium, where the Mets are going to play. But this battle between O'Malley and Moses sort of defines the Dodgers, or sort of the subtext to the whole Dodger run in the 1950s. And really, in the beginning, I think O'Malley saw LA as a negotiating chip. He said he could threaten to move to LA so he could get what he wanted in Brooklyn. And, he keeps flirting, starting to flirt more and more. City officials of LA are coming out to Brooklyn and to spring training in Florida to lure him. And he's making a point to be seen with them publicly, to get under the skin of the New York politicians. And finally, it becomes apparent to him that it's actually a better deal for him to go to LA.
But it's my understanding that O'Malley, to his part of all of this, right, was, well, okay, but explain this to me. My understanding is that there was sort of a more formal entreaty, and land was sort of circled for the potential move for the Dodgers to come to LA, but it wasn't the Chavez Ravine plot.
There were a few different attempts, and he was sort of shown different options in LA, but this was the part of the city that appealed to him the most. He was set on building a stadium in his image. Walter O'Malley is often painted as this sort of villain in these stories, and if you live in Brooklyn, that's extremely reasonable. But if you're a baseball fan overall, O'Malley has to be appreciated as a sort of visionary for the baseball experience and for making baseball a kind of pleasant spectator sport in a way that it hadn't been. He wanted to build a stadium that was family friendly, that had open concourses, that had all these kind of amenities that we now take for granted. And he saw that land at the intersection of the freeways, right in the center of the city, with a lot of acreage. It was 300 acres where he could build as many parking lots as he could possibly dream of, as a perfect canvas for him to embark on his project.
Well, maybe also explain a little bit about what's happening in the actual Chavez Ravine area in the midst of all of this, right? Because there are some holdouts that are still there. There's obviously some vacant land or unattended buildings now that people have been sort of somehow either scared off or bought off to. What's happening in the actual location itself while all this is starting to play out?
I mean, not a lot. So you have a few families who have stayed, and they live in this sort of quiet, semi-ghost town now, where, the schools eventually closed, the churches eventually closed, and it kind of gradually becomes just these few families who are holding out and who are refusing to give up their homes. And the city is embarking on this sort of ineffective quest to get rid of them. The city tried to, capture the dogs of the Adechiga family with a dog catcher and ransom them off effectively to get them to leave. Like, it didn't work. They were not able to get them out of there, and they were not willing to negotiate. There was a sticking point with that family about the price that was offered for their land by the government. It was 3 lots with 2 houses on them, and the city offered $10,050, and another appraiser had said it was worth $17,500, and the Adechiga said, we want the $17,000, and the city said no, and that was sort of a stalemate. Then this is all ongoing, and there's lawsuits back and forth, and all of it happening while the Dodgers are still in Brooklyn and negotiating this deal.
Well, the land, though, is still, it hasn't changed in terms of its, I guess, demarcation, right? It's still being held and I guess legally defined as being for quote unquote public use or public purposes, right? So it's not like people can move back in.
So it's amazing what a good deal or the promise of big league baseball can do for your definition of public. The city essentially decides that this is a public purpose. The council kind of just went, okay, well, we're going to say this is a public purpose. And so the deal is eventually struck with Walter O'Malley after the 1957 season. Brooklyn announces they're moving to L.A. They get to L.A. He lands at LAX, a conquering hero. There's throngs of people around him. And O'Malley is immediately hit with by a process server, basically telling him that his deal is illegal. He's going to court, and the battle has now just begun for him. So what happened was that opponents to the stadium deal, this is kind of a weird mix of entertainment industry people who didn't want the competition of the Dodgers, the ownership of the San Diego Padres, who were a Pacific Coast League team, kind of libertarian conservative politicians, and the homeowners who were not stuck, but still fighting for their land, have this consortium alliance of opponents to the deal. And they make a case that this is not a public purpose, that taking land from somebody with eminent domain and then selling it to an out-of-town businessman to build a private baseball stadium is the opposite of a public purpose. And it's a pretty good case, I think, looking back. So it goes to a ballot measure in L.A. And so soon after the Dodgers played their first game in L.A., and they played in the Memorial Coliseum, which is a football stadium, there's a vote on whether the Dodger Stadium deal should be held up. Which is
Interesting, fascinating, and also now it gets a little sort of strategic when it comes to public relations, right? I mean, O'Malley's making the decision, or somehow based on some level of assumption, right, that his team will have some level of eventual permanent domicile location and whatever, right? And maybe this is obviously still uncertain or up in the air, but, you wonder if a vote like this occurs before the Dodgers are even named, or certainly before they even actually land and start playing in what is admittedly going to be a temporary situation in the LA Coliseum. Even though the vote was relatively close, which I'm sure you'll get to in a second, from a PR perspective, it's probably the best way to go into an election or a referendum than having them already playing and being wildly successful at 90,000 people going to games.
Yeah, I mean, the Coliseum was huge, right? So it's this 100,000 person building. It was constructed for the 32 Olympics, and they're filling it up. Celebrities are going to games. It's a big deal in LA that the Dodgers are there. But at the same time, the city has a lot of second thoughts about, do we really want to sell our souls, quote unquote, for a New York businessman? Do we want to give our tax dollars to somebody to build a stadium that they're going to profit off of? Do we want to invest, millions of dollars of money to build highway exits to get to the stadium? And this is a complicated issue. And as much as people love the Dodgers and having them, 48% of the city ends up voting no, for staying. It was really close, and it took a lot of work from the Dodgers and from their allies to win this campaign.
So what, give our audience a sense of, and obviously all this sort of is dramatically unveiled in this book, which is just, it's heartbreaking. It's sad. It's and just all intriguing. the last holdouts, right? I mean, this is going on in the late 50s. You've got a lot of folks. It seems like I don't know. I mean, the vote obviously is a fait accompli, perhaps. Certainly once the results are announced, obviously that becomes still 40% still is a minority to the 60% or so that voted for it.
It was 52 to 48, actually. It was really close.
Much closer.
Yeah.
Okay, so my apologies. So, but the resistance, though, is still relatively strong. What kind of tactics are ongoing on this front? And it's got to be exceedingly difficult even to hold out, given all these seemingly growing forces that want to push sort of this thing into fruition.
It was difficult, and the families that were holding out were doing it under duress, and they were doing it because they felt strongly that this was their land and that they had been screwed over, basically. So while, even after this vote, there's still a lot of litigation about whether or not the stadium deal meets the public purpose, clause of that it was supposed to. The vote doesn't necessarily settle it. They say, actually, this has to go to the California State Supreme Court, or it goes to Superior Court and then the State Supreme Court. And at first, the family wins their suit in the Superior Court of LA. So even after the referendum, there's an injunction basically preventing O'Malley from beginning construction on the stadium. So the Dodgers are kind of playing in the Coliseum and not knowing when they're going to get to start building their permanent home. And finally, in 1959, the state Supreme Court says, no, actually, this is settled. The family wants to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. And while they're waiting to hear whether the Supreme Court will take their case, the city ultimately orders their eviction, which is carried out by County Sheriff's Department deputies. And the eviction on May 8th, 1959, happened to be on live TV in LA. So it was an event.
How? I mean, obviously that's got to be staged, right?
Well, it was so there was kind of a series of eviction orders, and it was well known at that time, what day those orders were for. So first it was supposed to be March 8th, and then April 8th, and finally it was going to be May 8th. And these are public documents and public records. And this is a story that's being covered regularly in the press in LA. So you have a media that's hungry for attention, a relatively new industry in TV news looking for pictures. And you have some politicians on both sides of this who want to make a name. That results in, not a very, it's a big city, but it's a small town in terms of, the civic center of LA. Whispers are whispered, and meeting the deputies at the front door of the Arechiga residence are a pack of photographers and video cameras.
So given that sort of dramatic live play out of events, you would think that would sort of draw more outrage and maybe solidarity for their cause, but it doesn't seem to sort of fall out that way.
So it does for a moment. There's a major outcry for a few days. It looks really bad. You have old women being carried out by deputies. You have people being carried out by their hands and feet, downstairs. You see the family watching their home get bulldozed right before their eyes. And you wonder, did the city really need to violently evict them? City and the county, to be fair. And then somebody gives a tip to a local journalist that the Arechiga family owned other property in LA. And a lot of the sympathetic coverage of their plight had been kind of written under the assumption that they were impoverished and they had nowhere else to go, and this was their only home, and this was the only way that they could continue to live was to stay here. When in fact for them, the home was their home. I mean, it was where they lived. And some of the kind of children and grandchildren of the family had bought property, and the family had done okay. They had worked hard and they had saved up and kind of done what you're supposed to do. And a lot of their stand was about principle. It wasn't necessarily about desperation.
It would seem, though, that I guess perhaps some of the journalistic drumbeat, perhaps by the Chandler-owned Times in particular, right, could make that story into more of a meal, I guess. And despite the seemingly innocence, I guess, but it's hard to sort of put that against the wave of popularism for the team elsewhere too.
Yeah, I mean, people were outraged in LA. The idea that this family could own other property and then portray themselves as needy. Even if I don't think they were really portraying themselves that much. A little bit. I don't think they really argued with it because I think it helped their cause. They were pretty savvy, but they really the media went after them, and not just the media. Politicians went after them. The mayor wrote like an 800-word statement that was published in the papers. Really, and it was just a pure, loathing sort of document about this particular family, the Arechiga family. They piled on after that, and the tide of public opinion turned.
Yeah, it seems like a huge double standard, and then some. So, all right, well, who's culpable in this then? How much is O'Malley culpable in this, right? Obviously he's here, he's waiting. I don't know how many plan Bs or plan Cs he might have in terms of other locations at this point. Or is he just kind of sort of a distant, not even sort of direct actor in all of this while this is playing out? Or is he basically the invisible hand behind all this, or somewhere in between that?
I think he's somewhere in between. I think he, when he bought that land, and he bought it under pretty favorable terms, in my opinion, I think he inherited some responsibility for it. I don't think when you buy a piece of property, you can just sort of wash your hands of what had happened there before and what was still happening there. That said, the wheels were set in motion way before Walter O'Malley ever came to LA. This is a tragedy that was decades in the making, and that doesn't really have one bad guy. I think the bad guy is sort of the system of government and corruption in LA in the 50s. Sort of kind of that's Chinatown situation. It's Chinatown. Forget it, Jake. Yeah. The notion that, just the public housing guys' fault. Not really. They did evict the families, but they had a purpose, and then they were undermined. I guess you could say it was the Chandler family's fault, but that's almost unfair to just pick a distant villain who's not really directly involved in the action. It was a civic tragedy that had universal civic responsibility at its heart.
Yeah, I guess the layman in all this would probably come and look at this perhaps in the review of history or maybe at the time as you'd think that it's, and maybe this is through the lens of today's modern sports complex, which arguably is maybe in the midst of some change given our current situations in life. But, it's the sports team, it's the civic pride thing, and it's a greater supposed good, albeit rich with private business interests, that, inevitably is going to be someone's detriment because there has to be a location. There's got to be a building and a construction, and, some people are going to get hurt, and, that's arguably the price to pay, so to speak, right? Whether it's in a domain or whatever, right? But, there's still, that doesn't make it right.
No, and people, this is a very unique story, right? The events with the public housing and the specific sort of sequences that occurred to lead to Dodger Stadium are kind of sui generis. They're not necessarily universal, but I think the overarching action where you have, in the end, a poor neighborhood or a poor working class neighborhood, people who had less political power displaced by people who had a lot of political power to make way for essentially a private business interest. That's a universal tale as old as time, and it's still happening right now in LA even.
Yeah, well, frankly, almost it feels to me like the Dodgers were able to, if you will, take advantage of a situation that was already convoluted, challenging, and convenient almost.
Yeah, I think it was. I don't think that, this Dodger Stadium happens without all the stuff that happened preceding the Dodgers move west. The Dodgers might not even move to LA if those things didn't happen. They might not have moved if O'Malley didn't see the site of Dodger Stadium, riding around in a helicopter in the 50s.
All right, let's round third base on this discussion, because this is fascinating to me, and obviously there's a lot of really excellent reporting and detail in the book, and we'll sort of promote it certainly before and after this interview itself, of course. Did you ever, in the process of putting this together, maybe this is more of a process question, did you descend into a rabbit hole or two about sort of some of the things we were just talking about, the what ifs, right? What if the public housing projects and or a continuation of that sort of progressive notion in the late 40s, early 50s in the country and applied to LA happened? Would do you think a Dodgers or another major league team come to LA, and or where else might this have either occurred, or other lands that come to play? And frankly, also perhaps what would have happened to Chavez Ravine had it not been disturbed, so to speak? Would it be, culturally relevant and vibrant? And I know those are all sort of speculative questions, but I'm sure there's a little what if that comes into play as you get through the story.
Oh, yeah. It's really hard to not speculate, right? I mean, the first question is about housing. It's interesting because Frank Wilkinson, the housing official kind of at the center of this book, he continued to insist all the way to the end of his life that had Elysian Park Heights been built, had LA fulfilled its 10,000 units of public housing that it was supposed to from the Housing Act of 49 and continued on with a vibrant housing program, the city would never have had the Watts riots or the Rodney King riots, and that, race relations and police relations and poverty in the city would have really been a lot better. And he was a true believer in housing and in the power of government to make people's lives better. I mean, it's hard to say what would have happened because it's really hard to imagine a world in which not only does LA build all that public housing, but continues to support it politically for so long. I mean, no city in America has continued kind of ambitiously fund and support public housing. And that's mainly because of federal government choices. That said, who knows? It would have been interesting. It would have been a very different LA. And in terms of whether that neighborhood had remained intact, I think it probably would have become gentrified, like all the neighborhoods that are around it. Echo Park in LA, Silver Lake, all these parts of the city, the Elysian Valley now have become gentrified, and you're seeing people displaced for different reasons.
Which is sadly a story that, to your earlier point, is sort of time continues to be endless and always sort of cyclically always the case. Where do you think, in your estimation, where do you think the Dodgers or another eventually relocated team coming to Los Angeles would have? Well, I guess that's sort of beyond the point. Where do you think the Dodgers would have gone had Chavez Ravine not ultimately happened? Did you ever think about that, or was there any
a little bit
to where that might go? Where they might go? Would they have taken over Wrigley Field and made it their own from the PCL, or what do you think?
They might have. I mean, Walter O'Malley owned Wrigley Field, so he bought Wrigley Field and then traded it to Wrigley Field. By the way, was a small stadium in South LA that had been home to the PCL Angels, and it was a very beautiful stadium. It wasn't that big. Some people in LA had been advocating for turning it into a major league stadium even before the Dodgers came, but O'Malley didn't see it as sufficient. So he ends up buying it and then swapping it to the city for the undeveloped land that becomes Dodger Stadium. And he could have gone there. The Angels played there for 1 year. He could have gone to Anaheim where the Angels played. He could have maybe gone to Inglewood. I think there were other possibilities, but I don't think any of them necessarily suited what he wanted. So it's hard to say what he would have done without this kind of, to him, perfect stage on which to set baseball.
Well, what do you think the legacy of all this is? Because, I mean, as the 60s sort of dawned, 62 when the park opened, it was actually, it's lost on me until fairly recently that, and I'm not a Los Angelino I've lived there for a couple of years in my life, but I haven't, I wouldn't grow up and raised there. I didn't realize that the Dodgers and the newly formed LA Angels played, I guess, the first 3 seasons both in the new Dodger Stadium.
The Angels' first season, I think, was in Wrigley. And then they moved to Dodger Stadium with the Dodgers. I mean, the legacy of this story, I think, it's complicated. There was, there's a line of thinking that because of this, the Dodgers were not able to draw Mexican-American fans for a long time until Fernando Valenzuela, entered the scene in 81. I'm not sure how true that is. I think that if you look at the vote in 58, Mexican-American neighborhoods in LA actually voted overwhelmingly for the stadium. And I think that probably there just wasn't that many Mexican-American fans going to games. I think you have people who see, this story as a cautionary tale, fairly. There's a perspective from the kind of libertarian side that you could argue that this is a case against eminent domain. And I think that's a pretty good case too. It's really kind of a funny thing because Dodger Stadium is this, and I write in the book about it. I love Dodger Stadium. I think it's a beautiful building. I think it's emblematic of LA in so many ways, good and bad. And it's hard to imagine an LA now without it. But it's also kind of hard to imagine a Dodger Stadium without all this fascinating and some of it ugly history underneath.
And here's my last question, I guess. How much, I think I know the answer to this, how much of this is remembered? How much is on the Dodgers organization to, I don't know, perhaps maybe with the wellspring of now sort of Latin American, Mexican fans, obviously the Fernando Valenzuela era sort of rekindling that. I'm wondering if any of the tensions and any of the ugliness of this story surfaced during that period of time and or since, or is it truly kind of buried and bulldozed like a lot of the land originally was done itself to build the stadium?
It's funny. There's a nonprofit started by some of the descendants of these families called Buried Under the Blue. So you hit the right words. The story is not officially talked about by the Dodgers, as far as I know. They didn't respond to my inquiries for this book, and the organization itself does not talk about it. To their credit, the O'Malley family talks about it. I mean, they have a perspective on it, but they are not. If you look at the Walter O'Malley website, which is really, really well curated, they don't own the team anymore, but they don't pretend this didn't happen. People in LA know about it. Some do, some don't. Some know more than others. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what happened. I think there's a lot of people who think the Dodgers kicked out 1,000 families, and it wasn't that simple. I think it just depends who you are. There was, a play that was pretty successful in LA. It's run a couple of times called Chavez Ravine. There was an album by the musician Ry Cooder called Chavez Ravine. So it's not absent from culture, especially in LA, but it's not always necessarily on the forefront of people's minds either.
All right. Well, let's give you a chance to promote. Obviously, we'll talk about it in the promos and all that kind of stuff. But tell us about the availability of the book, what you're going to do. I would imagine at some point, all things being equal, have some hopefully opportunity to maybe personally promote it, or are there any other alliances or other things that we might want to sort of keep an eye out or look for in the support of this book and giving our audience hopefully a reason to share this with other people and tell them about it?
Yeah, please do check it out and share it. The book has a website. It's stealinghome.la. You can find links to buy it there. I'm telling people right now, especially if you can find it at an independent bookstore near where you live, that's the best thing for the book and for you. It'll probably get to you faster because Amazon has deprioritized books, amazingly, and because those stores really need the help right now. I'm, on Twitter. I have a account, Eric, ERICNUS, News. I have a newsletter. It's called Sports Stories. Listeners to this podcast would probably like it. We cover a lot of obscure sports history. Sportstories.substack.com. And hopefully, when this is all over and the world's a little bit healed, I'll get out and be able to promote it in person.
All right. I know I say this a lot in all these episodes, but, proverbially and truly, I learned a lot. This is part of the Dodgers story that I was largely ignorant of. I know you native Los Angelinos may be more understanding and aware of this story than I have in my little sort of cocoon here in Chicago and having grown up on the East Coast. But it is an important part of the Dodgers narrative, whether the team currently and Major League Baseball currently acknowledges it or not. And you could do worse by picking up a copy of Eric's brand new book to learn more. It is extremely well written. It is written a lot through the sort of eyes and ears of the people who lived through it, the native Mexican and Mexican-American families that lived in Chavez Ravine prior to and during the sort of drama around eminent domain and then some around getting the Dodgers a stadium built in that very spot. And the book, again, is called Stealing Home, Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and the Lives Caught in Between. It is published by our pals at Public Affairs, and you can buy that copy for yourself and others at all the various places. Amazon, of course, we'll have a link to that on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with Eric Nusbaum. But as you heard Eric mention, supporting your independent bookstore, especially in these times, not a bad idea. You may actually get it quicker and sooner. And by the way, supporting your local community at the same time by ordering it in that fashion as well. However you get it, just get it for God's sakes. And you will enjoy it immensely, I assure you. You can follow Eric on Twitter at Eric Nuss. That's ERICNUS at Eric Nuss. On Twitter, you will find more about the book and him and the writing of the book and all what's going on around promoting the book at stealinghome.la. That's the website, stealinghome.la. And you can also subscribe to a tremendous long-form writing offering from Eric and his pals at sportsstories.substack.com. If you're interested in all kinds of interesting takes on sports history, you should subscribe now to that. That's, again, Sports Stories, there are two S's there, sportsstories.substack, substack.com, and sign up for that. That's a new revelation for me as well. And we look forward to getting more great stories from Eric. And God forbid we'll have use it as an excuse, perhaps, for another topic for another day. Let's see. Before we say goodbye to you, we want to thank all of you not only for listening and finding us and hopefully enjoying a little bit of respite from the world's ills out there, but if you want to follow us on Twitter, you can do that. We're at Good Seats Still. On Twitter, on Instagram, you can follow us there. We're at Good Seats Still Available. You want to follow us on Facebook. There's a page devoted to us there. If you want to bookmark our website and follow us and enjoy all of the 150 plus episodes to date and then some, we post all of them there. And there's some great imagery there, and you can download all the episodes, do whatever you want. And we're at goodseatsstillavailable.com. It's pretty easy to remember. It's also the place where you can click and send us some email, but you can do that directly too at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And on the website, you'll find a link you can subscribe to our weekly email newsletter. And that's our little advanced warning, if you will, about what we're going to be revealing each and every week, just a day or two ahead of the average Joe, so you can kind of get a head start, perhaps, on your listening for the week. Before we run, we want to say, of course, our continued and enduring thanks to our pal down in Atlanta, the Atlanta metropolitan area, Jerry Payne. Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence, and he's the guy who edits all of our stuff and makes us sound somewhat palatable. I know it's a challenge for him each and every week, but we appreciate it. Hey, look, he's getting paid. It's not a volunteer effort for sure, but it can be a bit strenuous sometimes, and we know we go out of our way sometimes to make it difficult for him, but he does a great job, and we appreciate it, as we do each and every week. And of course, we want to thank you, the listener. You've been tremendous over the years and especially the last couple of weeks. Thank you for your great notes and comments. We love the fact that we're hopefully helping you kind of get through the struggles out there. We know that we're just a mere speck of a distraction, given all the things that may be weighing on your respective minds these days. We are no different, we assure you, but hopefully doing this and listening to this gives us all a bit of a comfort and a little bit of distraction in the midst of all the challenging times. Please hang in there, everybody. Do what you're supposed to do. And hopefully next week we'll be back with another great episode. Thank you for listening. And we're going to take you out with, frankly, some great music that also really solidifies and complements this episode and this story that we got into this week with Eric. Ry Cooder, the well-known musician, did an album back in 2005 on None Such Records called, wait for it, Chavez Ravine. And it's really the entire album. It's a fantastic work that kind of gets into the entire story of what we kind of got into this week. And we're going to leave you with, I think, perhaps one of the most poignant songs on that album. It's called Third Base, Dodger Stadium. It's haunting, like the story itself, and we leave you with it. Again, Ry Cooder, it's on None Such Records. Thanks for listening, and stay safe and healthy, everybody. Take care.
Mr. You're a baseball man, as anyone can plainly see. Trade his game in this great land. Take a little tip from me. I work in nights, parking cars. shooting stars, same ones that we all knew back in 1952. And if you want to know where a local boy like me is coming from, third base, Dodger Stadium. Second base, right over there, I see Grandma in a rocking chair, watching linens flapping in the breeze, and all the fellows choosing up their teams. Hand over hand on that Louisville, round in the top, king of the hill, Mount to home, 60 feet. Baseball been very good to me. And if you want to know where a local boy like me is coming from, third base, Dodgers Stadium. Third base, Dodgers Stadium. Back around the 76 ball, Johnny Green Eyes had his shoe shine stone in the middle of the first base line. Got my first kiss, Florencia was kind. Now if the dozer hadn't taken my yard, you see the tree with orange toast carved. So many moments in my memory was sure was fun, 'cause the game was free. It was free. Hey, mister, you seem anxious to go. You'll find a seat in the 7th row, behind home plate